welcome in. We'll give folks a few minutes to slide into the Zoom. I'm chit-chatting here with Katie Milkman and our speaker panelist today, Emily Oster. How was everyone's snow days in respective cities?
Cold.
Cold.
Cold, difficult to drive.
Yes.
Uh,
All those things. I live in Center City, Philadelphia, and I actually saw a snowplow go down our street, which I've never seen before in Philly. We don't tend to plow, so that was pretty exciting.
That is exciting. We are not even thinking that that could happen to us. So I'm impressed, Allison. You're giving me hope.
Awesome.
they plow
Just
here, but they plow people's cars in. So
yes,
it's like everything is like every street is one lane because there's like cars plowed in. And then anyways,
totally.
yesterday I
Totally.
got stuck behind the Brown University shuttle and it was just
Oh,
like it couldn't go anywhere.
butter
Oh
bummer.
no. That does not.
We are on year 3 of a car-free experiment in Philadelphia, and I was very grateful to be car-free last couple days. All right, it looks like most people have drifted in, so let's get started. I'm Allison Buttenheim. I'm a professor of nursing and health policy here at Penn. I'm also scientific director of one of our hosts today, the Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics. Welcome to everybody. Hopefully welcome back if you've been to some of our seminars before that we co-sponsor with the Behavior Change for Good initiative. I'm going to hand it over to Katie Milkman, who doesn't need a lot of introduction, in just a second. But Katie, I want to continue your tradition of joke telling and pitch you a economist parent joke. You ready?
I'm ready. Hit me with it.
Okay. Now I have to find it. See if I can just remember it. Here we go. How do you know an economist is a parent?
I don't know.
They call bedtime a binding constraint.
We did test that out before.
We
So
did test that one out. That was the winner of some.
I think it was better than the rest. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Over to you, Katie.
Look, people are laughing.
All right. We got
I
some
see the
laughs.
emoji.
Few people are
There were like three.
a number of people thought that was funny.
Okay.
It was 2 or 3%. Oh, more laughter. I think.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the
Well,
feedback, everybody.
I will say, both my parents are economists, and when I first met my husband, and then who is also an economist, like he couldn't believe how much economics jargon my family used, just like in regular. And it's someone he was like, you realize like that's not normal. Like you realize like this is a weird, like your family. And I was just like, no, I'm sorry, like I don't get that. It's very
You're like, no, there's an endogeneity concern here. What else would I say?
It was more like micro concepts, a lot of opportunity cost, a lot of, margin, the optimizing on the margin kind of stuff.
I like that.
And Emily did just reveal to us that her kid's allowance gets a cost of living increase adjusted for inflation. So that's how else
we'll get into that in the Q&A, of course.
Parents are an economist.
Okay, I'm supposed to do a bio of Emily but after this banter. The banter was not in our script, guys. We went off script, but I'm supposed to do a bio of Emily, and then we're going to turn to asking her questions. Allison and I will take turns. We have a bunch of questions, like so many actually. We could keep her here for a whole day, not just an hour, but we only have an hour together. And then we're also going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A where you all can pose your own questions. So put them in as soon as you think of them, and we'll keep an eye on that, and probably we'll do sort of a half and half. Our questions, your questions. Okay, let me do the bio. So Emily, I love this bio actually. I didn't read it before. Someone else brilliant wrote it. Emily Oster is on a mission to empower parents by providing the data and tools they need to make confident decisions. I really like the mission. That's awesome. And it's true. In addition to being a professor of economics at Brown University, Emily is the founder and CEO of ParentData, a data-driven guide to pregnancy, parenting, and beyond. ParentData's weekly newsletter now has hundreds of thousands of subscribers, along with a massive social media community. As if that weren't enough, Emily is also a New York Times bestselling author many times over, whose excellent evidence-based books on pregnancy and raising kids include Expecting Better, Crib Sheet, The Family Firm, and The Unexpected. And I should say that I was like a super fan of Emily when Expecting Better, I think, was still like a little under the radar, and totally changed my life and affected how I became a mom. And got through that experience. I'm so grateful. And in 2022, she was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine, which is pretty darn cool. So we're really, really thrilled to have Emily here with us today for a Q&A. We're going to be focusing not so much on like, oh, here's a science question, as on the topic of how do we become great science communicators? Because Emily has basically knocked it out of the park in that respect. In so many respects, she's knocked it out of the park. But we thought that would be a really interesting topic for this audience, which is primarily academics and people who care about science communication. And so we're really excited to dive into some questions about her career and how she's gone from being like world-class academic to also world-class science communicator. Okay, so let me jump in with a first question, which Emily, I know you've done many things, and I'm going to start with the book, in part because I think a lot of the people in the audience who are PhD scientists may be thinking about writing a book. That's like a starter drug to this world. So we want to begin there. So when you set out to write your first book for a general audience, expecting better, unless there was a book that I didn't know about before that.
That's
okay,
it.
that was
First one.
Could you tell us a little bit about your goal and how your science communication goals have actually evolved since then? You're doing so much more than that one book.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, thanks everybody for being here and thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this. So I wish that I could say I had like a very sort of well formulated long-term life plan when I decided to write Expecting Better, but I definitely did not. I wrote that book really out of my own frustration when I was pregnant, and really was sort of a labor of like some combination of labor of love and labor of just like what the fuck is going on. And so I didn't, beyond sort of thinking this is a book that I would have liked to have, or this is the way I want to be interacting with my own pregnancy, and maybe other people would resonate with that. Sort of beyond that, I don't think there was a lot of like, it wasn't part of a sort of concrete plan. And it wasn't something where I imagined, okay, now my professional life is going to be more like this, So I had sort of written that book thinking like this is a one-off, like I'm going to write this book that I really feel passionate about writing and want to have be out there in the world. And then I'll kind of go back to what I was doing before. I was a professor at Chicago. I was writing papers about econometric methods and health economics, stuff like that. So I sort of thought like this will be like just a sort of hobby activity, and we'll kind of go back here. And actually, for a time, that's sort of true. Over time, as my interests evolved and as some stuff happened in my career, I sort of ended up deciding to write a second book called Crib Sheet, which is about younger kids. And that was in some ways a bigger pivot, because that was sort of a moment of saying, okay, actually, I'm going to like choose to lean into this kind of publication, this sort of audience, this particular audience, and that led into all the other stuff that I do now. So it's been a journey, but not one that was planned at the beginning, I would say.
Emily, do you have hypotheses about why Expecting Better and all of your books have been so successful? Like, what's landing for people?
So I think, I mean, who knows? Not really, but I would say I think with Expecting Better, the feeling that I had of like, I would like to be talked to like an adult, and I want to understand what I'm being told, and I want to be able to sort of make decisions based on understanding and evidence. I think that resonated more than I had, probably more even than I had expected with the audience I was speaking to. And I think that's still the thing that I hear from people when they say, you really helped me. It usually starts with, I really felt like I didn't have control, and you helped me take control and feel confident in my decisions. And I think the most successful stuff that I do is when I'm able to leave people feeling like I understand what works for me, and I understand, why I'm going to make this decision, not that decision. I think that's something people really want. They have it in other parts of their lives, and they didn't have it as much in here. And I believe that the book helps people get there. I think I
resonate with that. That's certainly what I loved about it. So I'm sure you've had this conversation with many friends who are thinking about writing a book for a general audience. Like, I'm sure they call you all the time. Like, if they call me, they call you. So I'm curious if you could tell us a few things you like to highlight when friends call you thinking about writing a general audience book. Like, what are some parts of the process that you try to emphasize or you think our audience might not already appreciate that people should really know before they take this leap?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I tell people to ask, to I sort of want people to understand, is to ask them sort of like, what are you hoping to get from this? So for a lot of academics, when they think about writing a book, it's kind of an extension of their research. Not exactly like I'm taking my papers and stapling them together, but like it's sort of like I do research on this topic and I think that a general audience would be interested in that. And that's kind of one kind of book. It's actually not the kind of books that I write. There's a second piece, which is there's some underlying tool or idea in, maybe it's my research, maybe it's other research in my field, that I think would translate well to sort of help people think about something else in their lives. And those are two pretty different kinds of books. And one of them is, the first kind of book is often quite synergistic with sort of research. It's kind of an extension of your work. And the other thing is not that synergistic with your research. Doesn't mean you don't want to do it, but I think it's really good for people to be clear on, like, am I trying to do this so I can enhance sort of the research, like further extend the research I'm doing, or am I really interested in doing something that's fundamentally very, very different? I think answering the question of what you're trying to write and why is the first step. And then the second thing I always tell people is try to write some of it, because often people think it's going to be really fun to write a book and then they actually hate it. Right. And I remember, and I don't want to I don't think he would feel bad, but I was writing my books around the same time Nick Epley was writing, who I adore more than anything, was writing a popular book. And I would see him sometimes in the hall and he would be like, I hate this. Like, I don't like this kind of writing. It's taking me forever. Like, what kind of, who would do this? For me, like, this kind of writing is so fun. Like, writing both of the first two books in particular, like, it was just like, I really liked it. I like the activity. And I think that if you don't like the activity, and it is a very different activity than writing your papers, if you don't like it, this is going to be like a terrible experience. And so try to make sure that you're going to enjoy doing it before you like sign a contract with a publisher. So those are two things I think people often miss about, like, to sort of about thinking in the beginning.
Those are great.
Let's put that in context with some other formats that you are also a master of. So you communicate exceptionally well in books. You have the newsletter, podcasts, Instagram. You're everywhere all at once. Lots of talks, lots of infographics, visual display of information. Talk a little bit about sort of your favorite modality, sort of what works for what kind of information that you want to communicate. And also, I'll just embed the follow-up right away. For trainees, like, what skills do you really want to make sure for science communication your trainees are skilled up in?
Yeah. So my favorite thing to do is to write, and maybe a little bit to teach, or to talk. But I really like writing. Like, I really enjoy it, and I like the challenge of thinking about how can I communicate some sort of difficult concept or help people really understand this. And I like doing it in writing. So writing is always my favorite modality. It's not always the most effective one. Getting people to read long form content is a challenge some of the time. And I think that that there is a different challenge when you're trying to do something like Instagram and sort of like, how do I get a point across in 90 seconds in voice without citations that is enough to not be dismissive, like enough to try to actually say, here's what some of the evidence says, or even give people a little bit of a sense of kind of why some piece of data is better than others. Like, that's hard to do in 90 seconds, a different kind of skill. I find that these things work well together, and I'm not sure that I would be as successful at doing some of this if I wasn't doing all of them. I will say that the skill of long form writing is something that's much closer to what we do as academics than the skill of like either showing up on a podcast or like doing stuff in social media. And a lot of what I think I'm building on in social media is a parasocial relationship, which is something that I'm not sure everybody wants. So actually, that's the other thing I would ask there. Like, I really like this, but the reality is, like, I'm doing a totally different job than I was before. Like, people sometimes they like me, sometimes they don't like me. They see me on the street, they know who I am, they think I'm their friend. Like people are, which I am. I'm like everybody's friend, but people are my DMs. But I'm developing something that's a little bit based on personality and a little bit based on expertise, and you have to kind of serve both of those to be successful in these like social media landscapes a lot of the time. And that is a really, really different skill than writing for a popular audience. And it's further from writing academic work than the sort of long form stuff. So,
And what about skills for your trainees? Like, what's the one toolkit you want to make sure they leave with?
yeah, I think so the main toolkit I want people to leave with is an understanding of how to write without jargon. So the biggest like challenge in moving from writing for a popular audience to writing for everyone is that writing from an academic audience to writing for everyone is in academia, we use a tremendous amount of jargon. And that's good, right? Like it's because like we're talking to each other, and it's much more efficient. What p hacking is, what omitted variable bias is, what what all of these words mean. And it wouldn't make sense when I'm talking to you for me to like go through, like, let me explain what they're. But when we introduce that kind of jargon into popular writing, it makes it very hard to understand. I think there is a fundamental mistake that is made in a lot of this sort of public communication, which is that people think that putting that jargon in makes them seem smart. This is certainly a mistake a lot of my students make. They sort of think, okay, I'm going to use these words, and that's how I'm going to communicate to this, to the listener that I'm smart because I can use all these words. What I tell them is effective communication requires that the person you're communicating to leaves not thinking that you're smart. You want them to leave thinking that they are smart and that you are trustworthy. And to make them think they are smart, you need them to understand. And if you are saying a lot of words that you think are, are so great and you're so smart, they're not going to understand. They're going to get mad. They're going to get confused. And so I think that like that kind of lesson, I would like people to take away. Like your job is to make other people feel smart. How are you doing that? How are you making them understand so they leave and they're like, yeah, I can totally get that.
I love that. By the way, there's something interesting about the fact that in the green room before we were chatting about the fact that you grew up in a family of economists who constantly use jargon. And when you met your husband and he was introduced to this world, he thought that was really bizarre, even though he's an economist.
And he knew all the jargon, he just thought it was weird.
Right. No, but it's so interesting that you're like, I was raised in this strange world of jargon, and now my expertise is extracting it and communicating to people. So anyway, I'm just pointing that out. This is an interesting bit for your autobiography someday. Okay. We would love it if you could talk a little bit about the very important question of the many health problems where we don't have a clear right answer that you weigh into and try to help advise people how to behave. And, this is something a lot of us are thinking about. We often don't have a perfect answer to a question. And we want, as you said, to make people feel smart, and we want to be trustworthy, and we want to give good advice. What would you say is sort of the best approach, and what is the approach you take to communicating about these topics where you can't be like, yeah, it's definitely A?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's kind of two pieces maybe. So I think one is thinking about the goal not as giving advice or telling people what to do, but as trying to facilitate good decision making. So I want people to know how to ask a question. So I want to be, if you're asking me about, like, I want them to know how to think about the question rather than just being afraid, sort of say like, okay, what's really the choice I'm making? I want them to be able to engage with the data. And then I want them at the end to feel confident in the choice that they made. And, there are many cases in which I do think there is a right choice. I do think people should vaccinate their kids for stuff. And I will say that, and I've said it, many times. But I also think the goal in communication is really to help people understand why that might work for them, which really means thinking about the decision making, not about the outcome. that is especially important when there are things where it's really actually not clear that there's a right choice, because ultimately, I don't really know. If somebody asked me, like, should I circumcise my kid? I don't know. Like, it's not really my business. But what I think I can help them with is how do I get to a decision that I feel sort of ex ante comfortable with, based on having a good
That
decision
was
making model.
jargon, Emily. You have to explain that to our
No, no,
non-academics.
this audience is jargon.
No, we have a
How
mix.
do
We
I
have
help
some
them?
non-academics.
How do I help them get to a decision that they feel is where they feel comfortable in the way that they made the decision? They feel confident in the decision that they made, so they can sort of go forward from there. And the other thing I think is really important for people to understand is that you can never be sure if it was the right decision. Some of the time, you are going to have to move forward knowing, like, I might have been wrong. And that's just the kind of uncertainty that we live with. And it can really paralyze your decision making if you are waiting to learn the right answer, because sometimes you won't. And you just have to accept we're going to make the best decision with the information we have. And we have opportunities to evaluate, change our mind later often. And you just have to live with that uncertainty. And that's like uncomfortable. Just something you have to sort of sit in that discomfort, which is unfortunate, but nevertheless true.
That's so interesting. Allison gets the next question, but I just want to say, like, I have a
Yeah.
hypothesis that kind of uncertainty is particularly uncomfortable as a parent. Like, I feel like when we live with that uncertainty, when we make a decision for ourselves or for even a subordinate at work, and we know it's not perfect, we're more able to live with that discomfort than when it's as a parent, because like your child, you feel like they're vulnerable and you're responsible for them in this very special way that I think makes that extra
Totally.
tough.
Yeah, you can, it's like, I mean, another way to say it is like almost everything we do in parenting has this heightened thing because we care so much about it.
Yep.
Right? Like, it's like incredibly important and we don't want to mess it up. And that means that we feel all of the feelings much more, much more strongly.
Right. So it makes it even more important to have your frameworks. Okay, Allison, to you.
Well, no, I was going to say, and most of us, the vast majority of us start out as complete non-experts. Like it's very hard to come into
Right.
parenting with
It's
a
true.
lot of expertise. And I think these days it's on display. Like there are these expectations of what it means to be a good parent, an evidence-based parent. Whatever, that's a lot. That's probably some of the motivation for writing Expecting Better and Crib Sheet.
Yeah.
I'm going to stay in this same line of questioning, pulling in Robert Kwan's question around what do you do, particularly when the evidence is thin and you don't want to overclaim. You want to be clear about where there's uncertainty, where there's trade-offs. That seems like a particularly tough area to communicate what evidence we do have, or to the extent there's guidance or decision-making guidance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the hardest stuff. And I think other than just being honest and saying, here's what we know and here's how we might know more. And, here's why sometimes it's like sort of here's why it's hard to know this. I think sometimes that's a very helpful frame, is to sort of explain, here's why not only do we not know this, but like we might never know it because it's too difficult to kind of do the experiment. I mean, an example that comes to mind is like I talk to people about family dinners. Family dinner is an example of something where like the correlations are super, super strong between family dinner, all kinds of good outcomes, but the causal evidence is really poor. And the reason it's basically impossible to get causal evidence on this is because it's very hard to manipulate the behavior. And so with something like that, I like to sort of help people understand, like this is so ingrained in the choices that in the other things that people are doing that basically can't change it, but you can't change it by encouraging people to do it. And that really tells us like families are kind of different. And so that is why it's hard to learn from this, but the correlations are really strong. And so you have to sort of put those two pieces of evidence together, and you're going to have to make a decision knowing that not only will you do not really know how large some causal effects are, but you're also never going to know. I think that last piece of sort of trying to communicate to people like, here's why we're not going to know this. The other thing I think is pretty important in those settings is to try to help people understand, what's the plausible size of this effect, right? So there are a lot of times in which we don't know the answer to something. We don't know how important something is, but we are fairly sure it must be small, because if it were big, we would know. And I think that's actually a very powerful point about a lot of these sort of tiny behaviors where people will come on and be like, the most important thing is blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, it can't possibly be that that's that important, because like then you, if it were, you would see it out in the world. So there's a little bit of like, let's dial down some of this, some of the like intense overclaiming that we see all the time. But yeah, I mean, I wish there were better. I wish there were better data.
No, I think it's one of the things you do really well, actually, Emily, as a follower of sort of just being transparent. Like, here's what I know, here's what we don't, here's where I would come down on it, but you have to make your own call, which I think is really clear and nice. Okay, let's wade into even hairier territory, and let's talk a little bit about something that you, I think, have been really brave to do, which is communicate about topics that have become politicized or controversial. I will say I avoid these like the plague. But I appreciate the scientists who don't and who tell us what they're thinking, what they're learning. Let's maybe even talk about a very concrete example that came up this year. 2025, in the last 12 months, of thinking about Tylenol and autism claims or changes to vaccine schedules, if you want to go there. Either of those, right? Those are both very politicized at the moment, much as we wish they weren't. So what is your advice about how to do that well? How do you, and I realize, of course, there's no way you're going to please everyone and there will always be haters. But when you do decide, which you do often, to wade in because it's important and you have a voice and you want to use it, that's great. Sort of, do you take a different approach to that than anything else? Do you just pretend that it's not politicized? What's your?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Okay, so I think first of all, if you want to be talking about topics like this, you need to be ready to ignore the comments, or to decide, like, there's a very, very good sort of something that I heard a number of years ago in the middle of the pandemic, about from Glennon Doyle, about about sort of thinking about like the like mailbox of criticism that arrives at your so there's like a outside your proverbial house of being a person, there's a mailbox where people can put stuff, and you can't control what people put in the mailbox, but you can decide what you take into your house. And I think about that all the time because, a huge share of the time when I write stuff, particularly stuff about, vaccines and Tylenol, about the dietary guidelines, about something people are talking about, somebody doesn't like it. Sometimes there's a lot of people. Sometimes it's not the people I expect. And there's a sort of holding the line of like listening to like, well, am I hearing feedback from people I respect who actually like, where I might want to, modify this or think say something different, or, is there something to learn from this? Or is it just like, there's a lot of criticism in my mailbox that needs to stay outside? And in order to do that kind of communication, you really do need to have to sort of either have or have learned the skill of not feeling bad about that kind of stuff. And that is a very hard one skill for me. It's something I work on a lot, and have gotten much better at over time. And so it means when I go to communicate about these things, I don't even think about it. Like, I just assume like I'm going to say the thing that I think is right and I think would be helpful for the people who are listening, and some people will be mad about that. And like, that's fine. That's just okay. It's fine.
Love that answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think one particular critique that many of us probably on this call were at the receiving end, on the receiving end of it during COVID, was the stay in your lane critique. That probabably showed up in your mailbox a lot.
I got that one in my mailbox, yeah.
Yeah, is that just
Never came home.
Any particular thoughts on like responding to that, or either internally or back out to the world?
So, I have always tried to be pretty clear about where my expertise lies. I do have a kind of expertise. I'm an expert in data. I publish papers in, reputable academic journals about like how we learn from evidence. And that is the expertise frame that I bring to Expecting Better, to Cribsheet, to my writing about parenting, and was the sort of expertise frame that I brought to a lot of the COVID stuff also. I think that there are many times in which we benefit from combining different kinds of expertise. So, and in my own work, my fourth book is about complicated pregnancy, and I was not in a position to write a book like that by myself. My co-author is a maternal fetal medicine specialist, Mount Sinai. He's like totally awesome. We wrote the whole thing together. And that was a place where, I look at the world and say, okay, like I have a lane. It's about data and evidence and about, this kind of writing. And those are the things I'm good at. But I'm not a person who treats high risk pregnancies, and we need someone else for that. And so I think that's, for me, that's where I come from on sort of the choices that I make about what to talk to. I hate the criticism of stay in your lane. It's one of my really it's one of the things that really I don't like, because I think it is totally bankrupt and not and sort of doesn't get at the real issues. So someone who is a doctor during COVID was going to come at this stuff from a different lens that I was. And there are things that we could talk about. And I'm always interested in let's look at this evidence together, and you tell me why you're reading it differently than I am. You tell me what you think is going on here. Let's talk about the data. I think the argument that we shouldn't listen to this person because of the letters after their name and their credentials is a very frustrating argument. And I still find it frustrating. Sometimes people say, people will say, well, I don't like anything you say. And I'll be like, we're literally saying the same thing. Your influencer account has all, you're a doctor, you're saying all the same things that I'm saying. And so I would love to hear more about where we disagree, and we could talk about it. But the sort of you don't have the right label is not a very helpful. I just don't like that. It's actually one of the things that really does bother me. I try to leave it in the mailbox.
Fair enough.
I'm glad you leave that in the mailbox. We have, I'm looking into the Q&A now. We have a very popular question that feels related, which is about trust in science. And you've brought up already that your goal is partly, is to make people feel smart and to make people trust you, right? Believe that you're trustworthy, which you are, right? You're just trying to make sure that they end up understanding that. This question is pointing out that we are in a moment in history, which we hope will not be long-lived, where trust in science is falling. And this person's asking, one, for advice on how to communicate research effectively to make it trustworthy. And second, to what extent all of us should be trying to convince people who don't trust science that they should, what we can do more generally. Mm-hmm. Also asking if that's hopeless.
Yeah.
So, which is a sad.
That's very hard. I think that the question about sort of how to communicate in a trustworthy way. So first of all, again, trust is something that is hard to build and easy to lose, but it is something you build. And so, there's if you're just communicating once to people, you're not going to build any trust. Really, it's just about kind of, are they reading this and thinking? If you're thinking about a long-term relationship in which you are continually communicating, that is an opportunity to build trust. And I think the way that we build trust in those relationships is by, saying why we think the things we think, saying where we're uncertain, coming back if we are, if we think there's something that that we want to change. There's kind of this analogy about the fire, how they communicate, how the fire marshal communicates in a wildfire, where they tell people, here's where we show up every day and say, here's where the fire is today, here's where we think it'll be tomorrow, here we come back tomorrow and tell you what happened. I think there's a kind of repeated game aspect of developing trust that is really important. And so I think it's less about how do you communicate about a single finding, and more about how you communicate over and over and over again. Should we give up on trying to get people to try? No, I don't think so. I would hope not. Although it's really, we're a very challenging, we're in a very challenging moment. I think, the public health establishment lost a lot of trust from the right during the pandemic, and then the current public health establishment has lost a lot of trust from the left. And so there's kind of no one who trusts the CDC anymore, and that's too bad. So I don't know. I don't really have an answer to the second part of this question. It's a really good question. It's just too hard.
Maybe
Oh,
Alice
maybe
knows the
I'll
answer.
push you down.
Allison, do you
Um,
have an
I
answer?
don't have an answer, but I'll tell you where our work on like misinformation is going. You know, trust is such an important part of that. We've been thinking a lot about disaggregating trust into the part where I believe that you know what you're talking about. Like I believe you're right, and then I believe you have my best interests at heart, right? Like,
Mhm.
and you sort of can't, it feels like you can't do one without the other. And you know, there's some questions in the chat about, you know, you're describing your relationship with all these folks out there as parasocial, wanting to connect with them, wanting to be everyone's friend. Like that part seems as hard as, you know, crunching the data and making sure you feel like you're making a, you know, a solid claim.
By the way, someone asked what parasocial meant. So not everyone knows our jargon.
Oh,
That means one to many. Or like we all know Emily and we feel like she knows us because we read her and watch her so often. But she actually, I mean, I guess now she knows me and Allison a tiny bit, but mostly she doesn't know us nearly as well as we think. And this asymmetry that celebrity status communicates. Anyway, if you've ever run into a celebrity you've seen on TV and never met, and you were like, you thought you knew them, that's parasocial relationship.
Yes.
Okay, Allison, I think you get the next question.
all right, I'm going to go with Angela Duckworth's question because it's also been upvoted a bunch, and we have more than a parasocial relationship with her. So, Emily, Angela wants to know if you think some social science disciplines are better at communicating to lay audiences than others. So, a bit of a provocative question, but you know, the economists, the behavioral scientists, the sociologists.
I don't, I think there are some people who are better at communicating than others to an audience. Angela being a good example of someone who's good at it. But I would, and I would guess economists are on average a bit worse than, you know, social psychologists or behavioral scientists, because
Angela,
we're
is that
often
what you
so
wanted to
weird.
hear?
But I think it is there's a much more individualistic component. I mean, I think one question you can ask is, you know, is there one of these fields where the rewards inside the field like weigh on ability to communicate outside of the field? And I think the answer is kind of no. Like none of these sort of fields have a particular like, you know, incorporate this kind of communication as something you care about with, say, a tenure standard. And so I think by extension, I wouldn't expect them to select particularly differently here. So I would guess economists are just worse because I just that's my instinct from knowing so many of them. But maybe I don't know enough social psychology. The social psychologists I know are much better at this. Behavioral scientists are
Yeah,
much
you
better
might
at
have
it.
an,
So
you have, I love that you came to the selection effect. Like, I know the good communicators in psychology, but you know more economists. Maybe that's what it is.
somehow
I know
it's
some
not
bad communicators
not
in
a con.
every field. um, okay. By the way, I noticed that Allison has done a far better job than I have of citing the awesome people asking questions. So I just want to give a shout out on the trust and science question to Andrea Bublitz, who made that great, put that great question in. We have another one from Jeff Mozenkis, who wants to know about talking to journalists who are under pressure to give straightforward answers, like
Mm.
wine is healthy or wine is unhealthy, even though all our studies tend to come with caveats. And how do you deal with trying to get journalists not to misreport headlines and give them honest answers that they will actually print with the subtlety that you care to see communicated?
Right. So one thing is now if I want to have something communicate with subtlety, I just write it myself. Like I just ask if I can write it myself. And I think there is a lot that, you know, of subtlety that one can convey in one's own writing that the, you know, news outlets are not looking for. I think the unfortunate answer to this is there is almost no way to avoid people trying to oversimplify stuff because their incentive is to have a headline that people click on and people want to know like wine kills you, wine doesn't kill you. You know, they don't want to know like Jessica, like it's like a nice headline that you've written in here, but like it's too subtle. You know, people really want these direct answers, and that's what's rewarded, and that's where the incentives are because that's what people click on. And so it's very, very challenging to communicate this well to journalists if you actually want your stuff to get published, to get covered, right? If you are doing research and you want someone to talk about it in the media, they're going to look for like the quick hit angle. If you don't want them to talk about it in the media, you can just do what my husband does, which is basically just like only ever be willing to like read the abstract of your paper to a journalist over the phone, and then they will never cover your stuff. So it's very easy to shut it down. But if you actually want them to do it, you have to figure like it's very hard to get them to not be clickbaity because that's their job or an incentive. So.
It's good to acknowledge the incentives that people have.
Totally, totally. I think the long-term relationships with like a small number of journalists is also a good way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the most effective stuff that I do on here, do with journalists, is people who I know and who basically will know, like, you know, if they're covering a study about something, they will call me just on background to be like, hey, you know, how can I cover this well? And that is like a good opportunity. But again, that requires a fair amount of, you know, investment and like time and you know, developing relationships.
Totally. All right, on this theme of investing time, there are a lot of questions in the Q&A, and we had a bunch ahead of time about ParentData as a project. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about it for folks who don't know how it sort of fits into your overall work and career. And then there are a lot of questions about like, how do you do it? Like, who is on the team? If I don't have a team, how could I do the same thing? Like, what's the important expertise to have? How does this all work?
Sure. So ParentData came out of the newsletter that I started writing during the pandemic. So I'd started a newsletter kind of after I'd written some books. I was writing and I had another book coming out. I started a newsletter because people said that was a cool thing to do. Then the pandemic hit. I was writing a lot about COVID. I did a lot more sort of public facing work during the pandemic. And at some point when sort of the COVID stuff died down, I was left with a sort of large corpus of writing about parenting questions, and also the realization that that there was, you know, space for something that expanded beyond the books that would like give people insights in that sort of could deliver content to people in a different way, hit them, you know, the same way I was trying to hit people during COVID, sort of be in their inbox when they're worried about something with their kid, give people a place where they can really like aggressively search the questions that they have, because new parenting like COVID is terrifying. And so ParentData is it's a website. It has a series of newsletters, some of which are sort of more newsy and some of which are more like time to your kids' age, time to your pregnancy. It's like gonna think about extent. If you know the books, it's sort of an extension of Expecting Better and Crib Sheet, but in a much more like searchable, deliver to you way. It's a subscription-based model. The website runs on a subscription model, and so people pay us and then they get the content. It's like very simple. And it takes a lot of time, and it's a totally different than like being a person who writes books. It's more like running a small tech startup. So I employ 10 people. We have an external developer, and so it's like a regular business, like a regular content business. And it does take a lot of my time. I'm on a half-time appointment at my university at the moment. And so that's still probably too much, but it's working for now. And, you know, there are always a lot of questions for me about, you know, what's the right way to spend my time, but this feels right for the moment.
Awesome.
All right, we have a bunch of questions about getting better at science communication and like writing and sort of like how to get started. So maybe I'll try to sort of put them together and say, well, maybe I'll give you a two-part. Like one, you already told us someone should try writing before they write a book, but is there anything, what are like the starter drugs in general for science communication? So that's question one. And then two, do you have some tips or lessons you would put if you were giving like a master class on like, these are some things a great scientist should try to learn to do well if they're going to write for other audiences?
Yeah, I think the starter drug is like op-eds about either your research or stuff that's about your research, that's sort of related to your research. You know, that's a pretty good like tip into sort of how much do you like this kind of how much you like this kind of writing. And those can be fun. Sorry, Katie, what was the second part of your
Oh yeah, the
question?
second is like tips. Like what are some things that if you're going to be a good science communicator, you should, like what's in your tip sheet? Like make sure you never say, you said don't use jargon.
Don't use jargon.
Like we know that. Like stay away from jargon. Are there other, like always make a visual, like
Yes.
always post a graph, or give 3 takeaways, not 2. Any sort of like rules of thumb that we could offer to people that you've learned? Like always start with
Yeah.
a story when you give a talk.
I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
I think not using jargon, visuals, I like a visual. I think relating to something in people's lives that they can connect to. We know, even though we all love data, we know anecdote is very compelling. And so to the extent you can sort of leave people with something in their, something in their head that is connected to their life, you know, that's better. I mean, so one person I don't know if you guys have read Peter Attia's book Outlive. And Peter Attia it's good. It's about like it's a pretty good book. It's about, how to like live a long time. And there's a lot of like stuff in the book, but he makes sort of one very core point, which is very easy to take away, which is that if you want to be like strong enough to lift your luggage into the overhead bin when you're 80, you need to be like lifting heavier weights when you're 40 because muscle mass decays over time. That's like the book is many, many pages long, but that's a very crisp takeaway. If you think about your communication as like, what is the one thing I want people to take away? Then you will get much further than if you're like, I want them to take away all this nuance, right? Like people cannot take away your nuance from your writing. They can take away like one sentence. And so that is actually very hard because as academics, we're constantly thinking about nuance. We're constantly thinking about, what is this footnote? And here's a limitation, here's this and that. Like in our academic writing, it's really all about, trying to hit all the angles and explain all the details. In this popular writing, we're much closer to like, what's the one thing I want people to take away? And you have to be comfortable with that, knowing they're going to take something away, but they're not going to take away all the nuance. One of my colleagues once, when I was in Chicago, he had written, he had sort of written an op-ed, and he came in my office, like about a paper of his. He came in my office and he was like, people are mad about these. He's like, I don't even think they read the paper. And I was like, Chad, they didn't read the article. Like, what do you mean they didn't read? Of course they didn't read the paper. They didn't even read the first paragraph. Like, you can't expect people to consume all of the nuance. Like, anyway, so don't expect people to consume the nuance. They're not reading the paper.
That's an excellent bit of advice.
You can pass on this question if you want, Emily.
I almost never pass questions. So
okay, great. Okay. I would love to hear your thoughts about how to be wrong in public. Like what to do when you get something wrong.
Yeah. Well, I'm wrong. I've definitely been wrong in many public ways. I think that there's kind of two steps to being wrong. So one is, trying to decide how wrong you are. So just because people are yelling at you doesn't mean that you're wrong. And I have at times made mistakes where actually when I look back on it, I think I wish I'd spent more time thinking about whether I was wrong or what I had done wrong. Like how much was this an error of communication as opposed to like an error of logic. But when one is actually wrong, as I have been in various times, the only thing you can do is just say I was wrong and here is how I was wrong and I'm sorry that I was wrong and here's why I try to do that again. Like I mean and in some ways like I think that is like there's no other thing. People are looking in that because you don't want to be wrong. And the sort of most public way I was wrong was like very early in my career. I wrote a paper, the paper is just like not right. And that's horrible. It was a horrible experience. Like, people like it's terrible to be wrong like that. And it's embarrassing. And, you sort of want it so badly to not be true that you're kind of always looking for like, well, could I have been right? It's like, no, You were not right. And in some ways, the best thing is just be like, yes, I was wrong. That was it. And that's just really hard because you don't want to say that you're wrong, but sometimes you are. And that is, in the end, I think, how one does develop trust is by being willing to say, here's where I was wrong, and here's how we're going to do this differently. And hopefully, if you get good enough over time about communicating uncertainty, you're not like quite so explicitly wrong. But yeah, just saying you're wrong. That's it.
I mean, it's
Love that.
tricky. It's tricky because in this moment of trust in science, you don't want to feed the beast of like, they never have it right. See, they changed their mind about, as new evidence that the internet hates that, right? And it makes it hard to know how to exactly pitch, like, we learned a new thing, or the thing we did, was
But that's it. Like, I
right.
think the thing is that's the sort of big picture skill, is to
Yeah.
sort of figure out how we can communicate enough to have people understand why this, like, now we're saying something different. And I think the mistake that is often made is sort of doubling down on something because you don't want to say, because you're afraid that of sort of this particular kind of blowback. But I think ultimately that's a sort of short term, that's a short term strategy.
I
Agreed.
agree. By the way, this is making me, I've been involved over the last couple of years in trying to fundraise for a project that is happening this April on science integrity and how to increase science integrity at the National Academies. And a lot of people have been really anxious about doing the workshop because they're like, oh, but science is already under attack. And if we admit that we have, there have been cases of fraud, won't it just make things worse? And I think this is related because, at least to me, it's like, no, if we make mistakes, if there are things wrong, one of the things science does best is like fix
Yeah.
them and be transparent. That's what scientists do. We like constantly try to make our methods better. We could constantly try to fix things. And that is exactly why you should trust science, is that we
Yeah.
will not hide. But anyway, it is interesting because our instincts are so different than that. So I'm with
Yep.
you. Okay, so there's a question in here that is from a high school economics teacher, David Sykes. And I think this is quite different than the ones we've been hearing, and I love it. He wants to know what skills you think high school teachers, and especially high school econ teachers, should be focusing on in preparing young people for college and the world. And also, he's curious if AI is any part of that or has changed what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think when we teach high school, it's been a long time since I did high school economics, but my sense is that there is a fair amount of focus on sort of like words and definitions and stuff about the macroeconomy and kind of like and definitions. And in my view, the sort of like how to think about sort of decision making and how to think about making good decisions is like a core piece of economics. And so I would love if this curriculum was a little more focused on like, how can we get people to understand the idea of opportunity cost in the context of their own life? Most people are not going to be economists, right? Unfortunately. And so but there are some of these tools, opportunity costs, comparative advantage, things that are jargony, diminishing returns, optimizing on the margin, which are actually incredibly powerful tools for making good decisions in your life. But to use those in your life overall, you need to really understand them, not just understand the definition, but you need to see them. You need to there's a phrase I sometimes use called situational fluency. You need to have the fluency to move the concept between situations. And if we just sort of said, like, here are the 5 or 6 concepts we really want people to understand, and we're going to just spend a lot of time like thinking about how they apply in so many different places so we can apply them in our lives. I also think if we spend more time in those classes on things that like connected to something in people's lives, they would remember them better. So that is what I'd like to see in high school economics. And I think that is also the answer to the AI stuff, because I don't actually think I think those, like, how do you make good decisions in your life is actually not something AI is super good at. Whereas, what's the definition of like a ISLM curve is something that like Claude can tell you if you ever need to know that, which by the way, you won't because it doesn't come up a lot.
Well,
I
unless you're
remember in high school calculus, the problems were always like, how fast will a conical water tank fill? And I was like, I don't care how fast a conical water tank will fill. Surely
So,
there's a better problem here.
have you ever filled a con in your whole adult life? Have you ever filled a conical water? No,
No,
no.
have it.
I remember tutoring like 8th grade students when I was a college student, trying to get them like more excited about math, and they were all just like, "Why do I need to know these things?" And that does feel like something in general we don't do nearly well enough. Just like give them the practical tools or show the connection between
Yes,
the theory and the
totally.
and life.
Totally. Thank you for that question, David Sykes, and God bless you for teaching high school kids econ. All right, we are rapidly coming up on the hour. I can't believe it. But I do want to end with a really rapid round, lightning round for Emily of underrated, overrated. This is something I pulled from Aileen Halsworth and Samuel Salzer on their behavioral design podcast. So I'm just going to give you a couple things, and you can tell me if you think they're overrated or underrated.
Okay.
Okay, the Pit.
Underrated. I love the Pit.
Awesome. X, formerly known as Twitter.
Overrated.
Okay. Hormone replacement therapy.
Underrated.
MM LaFleur, the dress company.
I love Emma LaFleur. I'm not sure, so I'm going to go with underrated because it's my very favorite.
Awesome. Okay, and the last one is that morning advice to get like morning sunshine at a low angle in your face to get you sort of up and your cortisol reset.
Oh my God. No, no. Like, this is an example of something that's overrated. Okay. And I will say it's an example of something that drives me crazy in this space, which is like people are busy. Okay. Like, we have jobs, children, things to do. And now it's like you have to go outside and get a low angle sun. People are just like, it's too much. It's too much. It doesn't matter. Don't do that. You don't need a vibration plate either, by the way. If you were thinking of buying a vibration plate, that's also stupid.
Wait, that's jargon. What is a vibration plate?
That's not jargon. That's social media influencer, Katie.
Okay.
You missed it.
It's jargon to me.
It's a vibration plate that you stand on, and it like improves it doesn't. But the claim is like, this is like the new thing. You stand on a vibrating plate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that has to be an SNL skit at some point. That's amazing.
This is like all over my Instagram today. People are like, do I need a vibration plate? What about red light therapy? Should I wear my red light therapy while I have my vibration plate? Don't do any of it. Stop it. See, somebody here, people own these. It's a thing.
Okay, amazing.
That is such a perfect place for us to wrap up. I hope and I know that everybody online has enjoyed this Q&A with Emily Oster. Thank you for coming to our CHIBE and BCFG webinar. Sam is putting into the chat, or showing, I guess, projecting our schedule of upcoming talks. We've got some great ones coming up in the rest of the spring. Thank you, Emily, for sharing your time and your expertise and your wisdom and your advice against vibrating plates. Your
sense of humor.
Thank you, everybody. And now Katie knows about them, so well.
I know, and so I'm gonna go tell my 10-year-old this evening.
There's a thing called a vibrating plate.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Do sign up for our newsletters and at CHIBE and BCFG, and of course, go check out ParentData. And thanks everybody for joining. Have a great rest of the day.